Hello and welcome to The Impact. I'm Mike McClanahan. On the ballot this fall is Initiative 2117, which would eliminate the state's carbon market and prohibit state agencies from establishing any type of carbon tax credit trading in the future. I-2117 would repeal the cap and invest system established by the 2021 Climate Commitment Act and bar state agencies from creating an alternative carbon market to replace it. The act is one of Governor Jay Inslee's signature climate policies and requires businesses that put out more than 25,000 metric tons of greenhouse gases annually to purchase emissions permits at quarterly auctions. The cap is lowered each year and the number of emissions permits available is reduced. The program brought in well over $2 billion in its first couple of years. It's a major source of funding for the work to electrify state ferries. Carbon auction revenue also goes to regional transit systems. A certain percentage of the revenue goes to tribes and is reportedly funding projects to address climate-related challenges such as sea level rise. Some of the money also goes to a network of new air quality sensors in high pollution areas. Some supporters of Initiative 2117 question the tangible environmental benefits of the Cap and Invest program and whether they outweigh the trade-offs for households paying more to heat their homes and fuel their cars.
The industry relies primarily on diesel fuel, and those fuel costs initially went up between 40 and 57 cents per gallon. So this is an impact not just on industry and the price you pay at the pump, but it's an impact on all consumer goods that you buy as those costs are passed along.
Opponents of the repeal initiative say I-2117 will eliminate a path to a cleaner transportation future that forces some of the biggest polluters in the state to pay for improvements. They see the 2021 law as a transformative shift at a critical time and argue that the repeal initiative would undermine efforts to protect vulnerable populations and ecosystems.
Initiative 2117 is a purposely misleading initiative. It does nothing to guarantee lower costs for working families.
Still ahead, one supporter and one opponent of Initiative 2117 will join me on the set. Stay with us.
It will dwarf Katrina. It'll be absolutely the largest thing that we will have had to have dealt with in our country. We know the clock is ticking.
Joining me now, Vice President for Research for the Washington Policy Center and a supporter of I-2117, Todd Myers. And we also have initiative opponent and House Majority Leader Joe Fitzgibbon, a longtime leader on environmental issues in the House Democratic Caucus. Thank you both for your time here today. Let's start with you, Todd, but I do want to hear your response to basically the reverse of the same question immediately after this. But Todd, from your perspective, what are the strongest arguments for repealing the Climate Commitment Act with Initiative 2117?
Well, I think people have talked about the price, obviously. The price was much greater at the pump and in energy than people expected. Even Governor Inslee has said that the Department of Ecology got the projections wrong, and the Department of Ecology's own estimates say that it could be up to about 80 cents a gallon by the year 2030. But as somebody who's worked on environmental policy for about 25 years, when I was at the Department of Natural Resources, did things like pushed for a ban on old growth harvesting, was on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council. One of the most frustrating things to me is that this is really a special interest and political bill masquerading as an environmental bill, because there's far more money that goes to special interests and to political agendas than there is for the environment. I'll just give you one quick example. There's about $12 million, which is just 0.5% of the total spending for fighting wildfire, for reducing wildfire. There's twice that much just for planning high-speed rail, not building high-speed rail, just planning. And there's 4 times that much just in grants for more Growth Management Act planning. There's far more for bureaucracy, for special interests, and what's unfortunate is that while this says it's an environmental program, the environmental programs and the funding is very low, and what goes for politics and government and things like that is what most of the money is. And that, I think, is the frustration, because a lot of people care about helping the environment, reducing CO2 emissions. This really doesn't do that. We need to do a much better job. The CCA doesn't do it.
Representative Fitzgibbon, what are, from your perspective, the strongest arguments for keeping the environmental regulations and emissions control system that was set up by the CCA and rejecting 2117?
Yeah, I think the fundamental question, Mike, with 2117 is, do we want Washington to have a cap on our greenhouse gas emissions and lower that cap over time? Do we want the 100 largest polluters in Washington state to be able to pollute for free like they were before the CCA, or do we want them to have to pay the state of Washington for the impacts that that pollution causes, whether that's through wildfires or more extreme weather events or air quality problems or just the overall impact of global climate change? I think that defeating Initiative 2117 would show that we expect those 100 largest emitters in our state to reduce their emissions over time, and that we want to continue making investments in things like new ferries and salmon recovery projects and wildfire prevention and incentives for lower polluting trucks and electric school buses. There's a lot of things that make life better for Washingtonians, that make air quality better for Washingtonians, that make habitat better for salmon and orcas and all the species that we care about as a state, that we just wouldn't have those resources if we don't ask those 100 largest polluters to pay for the impacts of their pollution anymore.
So I guess a more specific version of that question, or maybe to drill in on one detail, what do you see as the most immediate impacts that voters will notice if this is passed?
So prices will immediately go down. Right now, it adds about 24 cents a gallon for a gallon of gas. They'll see that. Prices will go down for energy. But the fact is that over the since 2019, the operating budget has increased by about $17 billion. We have money to do good things. I've been a longtime supporter of spending more on salmon habitat, and I've been advocating for that before this. We have the money to do that. It simply hasn't been a priority. So it's not a lack of resources. And second, people want to make sure that they get what they pay for. They're paying a lot of money, more than people expected. Farmers across the state were promised that they wouldn't pay into this, and they've paid $150 million, despite the fact that they were promised that they wouldn't. What are they getting? And what we find is that the programs that are out there are more about rewarding political allies than actually helping the environment. And I think that's the fundamental problem. And it's why Washington has missed every single one of its climate targets. It's why salmon aren't recovering. It's why we are seeing more forest fires and more smoke over the last 10 years, not less. We've failed because every time we have an opportunity to help the environment, we prioritize politics, and the CCA does that too.
From your perspective, what are the most immediate impacts that voters are likely to notice, or just the impacts in general?
Well, I think voters will immediately notice impacts on the transportation budget. So we have $600 million programmed for ferry construction out of Climate Commitment Act resources. We would either have to choose to not finish the ferries that we know we need to build in order to maintain that system, or we would have to take that money from somewhere else in our transportation system that could impact congestion, could impact safety. So I think that's a very near-term impact. We would see a lot of projects that are currently planned for salmon recovery, particularly fish passage barrier removals or estuary projects that would just not have the resources available. I do not think that the legislature is going to choose to move resources out of the general fund, where it's paying for things like K-12 education, higher education, childcare, healthcare, into estuary projects or into wildfire prevention projects, because we have a dedicated revenue stream that's resourcing those programs now. And if that goes away at a time that we also are seeing real constraints on our ability to pay for things like K-12 education, we have choices, and the choices are going to mean that we'll have fewer resources to spend on things like transportation and salmon recovery if that dedicated revenue stream that's resourcing those projects goes away.
So, Todd, this question for you specifically here. Would repealing the Climate Commitment Act allow large industrial companies to produce more greenhouse gas emissions without the financial incentive that currently is in place to rein those in?
Yeah, and I have been an advocate for putting a price on CO2. We do have to have a climate policy. There's a variety of ways that we can do that. But again, we have had policies and we have consistently failed to meet those targets, even though we have promised again and again that CO2 emissions would go down. And with this, with the CCA, the money doesn't even require emissions reductions. As I've pointed out before, we haven't even released emissions reductions since 2019. If we cared about reducing CO2 emissions, the grants and the money that comes from the CCA would require those emissions reductions. They don't. I'll give you another example. Just last week, a grant closed for methane capture from landfills, something that actually is a really good way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the grant administered by the Department of Ecology has nothing in there that says that they actually have to show that they've reduced methane emissions. That's the problem is that the rhetoric of we need to do this to reduce CO2 emissions is contradicted by the fact that we constantly miss those targets and the programs that are funded don't actually require CO2 emissions reductions. So yes, we need to do things about climate change. I personally do. I think that the state should, but we need a program that is effective and requires the money to be spent in an effective way.
What's your response to that criticism, that the program doesn't specify the money should be spent specifically purely for decarbonization, I suppose?
Well, so we have a lot of great programs resourced by CCA that do reduce emissions, like incentives for medium and heavy duty vehicles like trucks and school buses and garbage trucks to lower the cost of the zero emission vehicles, to provide resources for small businesses and residential multifamily as well as single family homes to get cleaner HVAC systems. But not every single thing that we are investing in with CCA dollars is specifically about greenhouse gas reduction. For example, salmon recovery projects are critical for the survival of salmon, for the survival of orcas, but they don't necessarily reduce CO2 emissions. Better air quality monitoring networks, so we know where the air quality hotspots are, where we know where there's significant disparities in air quality across our state. That's being funded by CCA. Todd talked about the resources for local governments to help them plan for climate change, both to reduce their emissions and to make sure that they're ready for a changing climate. I think you only have to look at places like North Carolina, Georgia, Florida to look at what happens when local governments and state governments don't invest in adaptation and resilience. We know we have communities across Washington state. Just look at the floods in Whatcom County, look at the fires in eastern Washington, as well as increasingly in western Washington, to see where having local governments be able to plan to keep people out of harm's way, to have the infrastructure in place to prevent floods and wildfires from reaching populated places really matters. And that may not reduce emissions in the short term, but it's still really important to Washingtonians.
Let's talk about that, because I think that's a good point, right? We do want to prepare for changes in climate. But let's talk about floods. There is a grant of $4 million to reduce flooding in Nooksack, along the Nooksack. All $4 million of it is for more government employees. Zero of it actually gets on the ground. You mentioned projects for salmon barriers, culverts. Very important. We're under a federal court order to do this. This is not a choice.
Not for local projects, not for private fish passage barriers. We have a federal court order covering the state culverts, but the projects that we're investing in for local projects are not required by a federal court.
But there
They're
is
only
money
paid
in
for
the
because we
CCA.
have CCA investing in those projects.
But there is money in the CCA for culverts that are covered by the federal government.
Yeah.
Those projects are going to get done with or without the CCA.
At the expense of road projects.
No, that's why. So you're going to be vindictively and take money away from road projects?
No, we just don't have enough money to do both.
We do have money to do both.
By
you
defunding
have not,
what? What would you defund?
Well, there is a collective
K-12, higher ed?
There's a collective bargaining agreement that's cost $1.3 billion. Would you say that that's raising salaries for state employees is more important than K-3 or K-12
I would
or
say
higher
that
ed?
keeping state employees able to do their jobs, keeping state employees
Okay,
able
so
to
yes,
serve it
so
is
you are
also
making,
important.
Exactly.
The more
so
than
you
one
do
thing,
have priorities, and your priority is increasing funding for state employees as opposed to
I would say
transportation.
it's dishonest to say that we are not, that salmon recovery projects that are not required by the court injunction but are funded by the CCA, are that those are going to happen anyway. That is disingenuous.
We have the money, but as you pointed, we have the money. You have prioritized increasing salaries over doing those projects. So say that. Say, look, this is my priority. But claiming, oh no, we don't have the money, when you clearly do, I think that's disingenuous.
In terms of the concept of putting a price on carbon and various ways that can happen, the Climate Commitment Act chose a targeted approach. Instead of, you talk about cap and trade systems, this is cap and invest. Correct me if I'm wrong, you've supported a price on carbon before. There was an initiative that was defeated in 2016 that billed itself as being basically neutral in that there was a tax cut connected to a sort of blanket tax on carbon within the initiative, at the risk of over-summarizing. So why not target the investments? Or do you think that there's a better approach in general? Is one better than the other?
Well, and the system that we have now was put on the ballot in 2018, essentially, very similar, a
That's
cap and
not
trade system.
correct.
And it was turned down too. So the voters have had two opportunities.
The 2018 initiative was a carbon fee. It was not a cap and trade system. It did not require that emissions go down over time. It had no guarantee that emissions would actually go down. It was strictly a carbon tax.
We had a cap, and it was set to, we have a state cap, right? We have a state target, and it was set to meet that target, okay? So yes, we have had these on the system, on the ballot before, and the voters have consistently rejected them. Now, I'm frustrated by that. I wanted the 2016 to pass. But if we're going to spend money, and I think that it may be worthwhile to spend money on reducing CO2 emissions, make sure that you get the most bang for the buck. We are spending money on things that don't yield any or very tiny environmental benefits for very high costs. Subsidizing electric vehicles for people who are wealthy yields tiny environmental benefits for very high cost. There's lots of things that we can do that maximize environmental benefit. So great, target the spending. We can even spend state money, but make sure that we get what we're paid for, not prioritizing it based on politics.
One point of contention from critics of the regulation in place currently was the potential price impact on gasoline, on energy usage in Washington. Critics have said that the state was not straightforward with how much this program would impact price of gasoline or just the way that it impacts prices in general. Is that fair? Do you agree or disagree with that? And if so, explain your reason, please.
I guess I don't know who the state is in that,
okay.
that assertion.
Sorry.
The governor made comments, which I'm not, the governor.
Sure. Proponents, I guess I'm lumping people together, but for example, the governor's quote about pennies comes up a lot. There's concern about just how much, whether or not this did affect gas prices and to what extent. And so I just want to see if you could react to that.
So I don't think we ever were unclear about the fact that this was that the 100 largest emitters in the state, including our oil refineries, were going to have to pay for the impacts of the combustion of their product on our air, on our climate. And that the oil companies in particular were going to have a significant bill to pay in order to pay for the costs of the greenhouse gas emissions that they are responsible for. I think that we also always knew, and I don't think we ever were unclear about the fact that some portion of that cost was going to reach consumers. It's the oil companies' decision about how much of that cost they want to pass on to consumers, how much of it they want to absorb through their shareholders or their executives' profits. I think that, and we still don't know because we don't have transparency into their books the way that we do into electric and gas utilities books. I think the question going forward is if you were to eliminate all of those costs for oil refineries, are they going to pass along all of those savings to their customers, or are they going to pad their profits for their shareholders and their executives? The truth is we don't know. We don't have visibility into their books. We had a bill this session that was proposed that would have let the state look into oil companies' books and determine how much is actually coming from our toxic cleanup tax, how much is actually coming from our cap and trade system, how much is actually just the price of crude oil on the global market. And that bill didn't pass and it was heavily opposed by the oil industry. So I think the assertion by initiative proponents that all of the costs of CCA and all of the cost reductions that the oil companies accrue if the initiative passes will pass along to customers, I think that just requires a level of trust in oil companies that I'm not sure I share.
Well, the oil companies are supporting your campaign like BP, and we know that actually that the costs are passed along to
all
customers.
Of them?
Yes. Because
all?
Yes.
Really?
Because BP has an invoice.
Then why did WISPA advertise last summer against this initiative if they were able to pass along 100% of the cost to their customers?
Why didn't they?
Why did they? Why did they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on ads last year, criticizing
I don't know.
the CCA
but I can tell you what
when
BP,
they were passing along 100% of their cost to their customers?
I can tell you with what BP, who supports your campaign, does on their invoices. So they have a line item called Cap at the Rack. And that line item says, here's how much the tax is for the CCA. It is virtually identical to what the price is. We have the invoices. We can see it. It's not a mystery. They put it on there, just in the same way that your grocery store puts sales taxes or anybody else puts sales taxes on there. BP does that. Now, will prices go down? Absolutely. And I offer to bet to both you and Rachel Smith of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce that if 2117 passes, that we will see prices go down. Neither you nor Rachel took me up on that because you know I'm right. Because you know that when you cut taxes, prices go down. Now, if you want to take me up on the bet, great. I'm willing to guarantee that yes, prices will go down. If you say that's not going to happen, then I'm willing to bet.
I want to follow up on that too. arguably, potentially the largest business organization in Seattle, Seattle Chamber of Commerce, Puget Sound region probably. And they are opposed to the initiative 2117. The Association of Washington Business, largest business organization in the state, neutral on that initiative, while it is endorsing the 3 other initiatives on the ballot this fall. Does that signal that there is an economic cost to undoing this, undoing the regulatory regime that's in place now?
I think it signals that big businesses have found a way to deal with the regulation. And I understand that. I'm not going to be critical of Amazon. I spent a lot on Amazon Prime yesterday, on Prime Day. But they have made a commitment to be zero emission by 2030. This state program, paid for by taxpayers, helps them do that. So it shouldn't surprise us. BP is going to profit from the regulations in this. So it doesn't surprise me that big business. But who pays for this is families, farmers across the state of Washington. Again, farmers were promised that they would be exempt. By our estimates, they have paid $150 million in costs that they were told they wouldn't have to pay. We lose 14 farms a week, 2 farms a day in Washington state because of high cost and the difficulty. We are piling costs on them. They're the ones who pay. So it doesn't surprise me that big business has found a way to deal with that. They have the lobbyists, they have the lawyers to deal with it. It's the small businesses and the families that don't have them.
What's your perspective on that? And also, I should let you know, we're getting close to within the 2-minute time frame. So after this, I'm going to transition to close.
I think it's illustrative that you have support from the Washington State Labor Council, from Washington Conservation Action, from a majority of Washington tribes, and from the Seattle Chamber of Commerce. That you have the organizations representing labor, environmental advocates, tribal organizations, business, and businesses all saying that that repealing the Climate Commitment Act is the wrong thing to do. That you have the Seattle Times, the Everett Herald, and the Columbian all saying that this initiative is going to harm Washingtonians, and that the Climate Commitment Act was a smart policy to reduce Washington's greenhouse gas emissions. You don't see the kind of infighting among those different groups that we have historically seen, for example, in the 2016 and 2018 initiatives, which were much more like fights between the environmental community and the business community, which the Washington State Labor Council stayed neutral on the initiative in 2018. Instead, you see organizations across the political spectrum that care about the health of our economy, that care about the health of our transportation system, that care about the health of our climate, coming together to say that this initiative would harm Washingtonians, would harm business, would harm workers, would harm the environment, would harm tribes.
Okay, so we've got just right at 2 minutes. So if you could, closing thoughts in 1 minute.
Yeah, I think I understand why special interests, as I said, the CCA is about special interests. Unfortunately, it's not about prioritizing the environment. So it doesn't surprise me that hundreds of special interest groups come together to support a bill that supports them. But more than 400,000 people signed the initiative because they see the costs. Washington's gas prices went to the highest in the nation last year, precisely because the tax is on gasoline and fossil fuels. Okay, great, that's fine, but admit that. If we're going to pay that cost, what do we get? And the reality is that we are not getting the environmental results that we are promised. We are getting support for special interest groups and other things like that, and average people are paying the cost, and that, I think, is the fundamental problem.
If you could close us out here in a minute or less.
Sure. I don't see the Suquamish tribe, the Swinomish tribe, the Tulalip tribe, the Puyallup tribe, the nurses union, the teachers union, the PTA, the American Lung Association, as special interest groups. I see those groups as advocating for things that Washingtonians broadly care about: clean air specifically within school buildings, salmon recovery projects. So I think the fact that you have the breadth of support for defeating this initiative says something. I think what this ultimately comes down to is, do we want to cap Washington's emissions? Do we want to bring that cap down over time? Do we want to hold the 100 largest polluters in Washington accountable for their pollution? And do we want to keep investing in transportation, salmon recovery, and wildfire prevention? I think that choice is pretty clear for Washingtonians, and I think that they're going to vote no in November.
Well, very fiery discussion here, and we will have to leave it there. Thank you again, Majority Leader Fitzgibbon and Todd Myers. We do appreciate your time. Thank you. The Impact is available online in video and podcast form at tvw.org. Follow us on X at The Impact TVW. Next week, we'll look at the debate over Initiative 2066 to prohibit any local or state bans on natural gas service. Please join us then. Thank you for watching, and have a great week.